Welcome to Femme Fantasy, where transformation, elegance, and self-discovery come to life. Airports always made me nervous, even when everything went smoothly. Maybe it was the endless lines, the beeping scanners, or the way time seemed to move differently once you stepped inside.
But that morning, nothing was smooth.
I was already running late, juggling my boarding pass, coffee, and suitcase when I heard the dreaded announcement echo through the terminal. Final call for Flight 232 to Seattle. I bolted toward the security checkpoint, half spilling my coffee, muttering apologies to everyone I bumped into.
The line looked mercifully short, but my relief didn't last long.
The guard waved me over to a side lane, where a tall woman in a dark blue uniform stood with her arms crossed and the kind of calm authority that could freeze time. "Sir," she said, scanning my ticket, "you were flagged for a random secondary check."
Of course I was.
"Oh, great," I muttered under my breath, trying to smile.
Is this going to take long? My flight's boarding now.
She didn't answer, just gestured for me to set my bag on the counter.
I unzipped it, trying not to look as flustered as I felt. But when she opened it, her brow furrowed.
She pulled out a handful of clothes, crumpled, wrinkled, but definitely not mine. I stammered. "That's not my stuff."
She raised an eyebrow.
"It's what was in your bag." I blinked. Instead of my suit and laptop, there were sparkly fabrics. Something that looked suspiciously like a pair of tights.
My heart dropped.
My luggage tag was there, my name was on it, but somehow, someone else's clothes had ended up inside. "This must be a mix-up," I said quickly. "Someone must have grabbed my suitcase." The guard looked skeptical but professional. "We'll have to hold your bag for inspection while we sort this out." "Wait, hold it?"
"But my flight." She glanced at her watch.
"If you still plan on boarding, you'll need to travel with what you're wearing." I looked down at myself, wrinkled travel clothes, coffee stain on my shirt, and no jacket because it was packed. The thought of spending the entire flight like this made my stomach twist. "Can't I just?"
Then she did something unexpected. She sighed, looked around, and lowered her voice.
"You're not the first person this has happened to today.
We had a luggage carousel glitch.
I might be able to help, but you'll have to trust me." I blinked. "Help how?" She gave a small, knowing smile and motioned for me to follow her into a staff hallway behind the checkpoint.
"Come on," she said.
"We'll find something to get you on that flight looking a little less coffee-stained." Her tone was half teasing, half sympathetic. I followed, feeling both grateful and suspicious. The hallway opened into a small security office, lined with lockers and uniforms. She walked over to a cabinet and rummaged around, muttering to herself. When she turned around, she was holding a few neatly folded items, definitely not a suit or business wear.
More like uniform pieces.
I started, "That's..."
She cut me off with a shrug. "It's all I've got. Clean spares."
"If you want to make your flight, this is your best shot." I stared at the outfit in disbelief. Dark tights, a pencil skirt, and a fitted blouse clearly meant for someone on her team. "You're serious?" I asked. She smiled faintly. "I wouldn't offer if I weren't. Don't worry, I'll vouch for you at the gate. No one will even notice once you've got your jacket on." I laughed nervously. "You think I can pull this off?" Her eyes glimmered with amusement. "You'd be surprised what confidence and good posture can do." And just like that, I found myself holding a set of clothes that didn't belong to me, debating whether I'd rather miss my flight or attempt the most bizarre wardrobe change of my life. As I stood there frozen, she added, "You've got 5 minutes before boarding closes. Your choice." 5 minutes. One impossible choice. And somehow, I knew I was about to make the strangest decision of my entire trip. I stared at the outfit in my hands for a long moment, half expecting the guard to start laughing and tell me it was all some airport prank show. But she just stood there, one hand on her hip, the other holding a radio, looking entirely serious. I could tell from the faint creases at the corners of her eyes that she'd probably seen every kind of traveler meltdown imaginable, and this was just another story in her day.
I took a slow breath. "Okay," I said finally.
"But if this ends up on some security camera compilation online?"
She smirked.
"Trust me, our footage doesn't go anywhere. Now hurry." She gestured toward a small restroom adjoining the security office.
I hesitated only a second longer before stepping inside.
The door clicked shut behind me, and suddenly it was just me, a mirror, and the most unusual dilemma of my life.
I glanced down at the neatly folded pile on the counter.
The blouse was crisp and navy blue, the skirt a darker shade that looked impossibly narrow. I ran a hand over the material, half in disbelief. This is insane, I muttered to my reflection. Absolutely insane. But as I peeled off my coffee-stained shirt and stood there in the quiet hum of the fluorescent light, something in me shifted. Maybe it was exhaustion, or the adrenaline of trying to make my flight, or just the strange absurdity of it all, but I started laughing. A low, nervous laugh that bubbled into something genuine. "This is really happening," I said to no one. The blouse fit better than I expected. Snug but not tight, the fabric cool against my skin. The skirt was a challenge, though. I had to wiggle and adjust, nearly losing my balance once, before it settled in place. When I caught sight of myself in the mirror, I froze. It wasn't just that the clothes looked foreign on me. It was that I didn't look entirely wrong in them. My reflection was strange but oddly confident. The shape, the posture, even the way I was standing, it all felt different. A knock at the door startled me. "How's it going in there?" the guard called. Almost done," I said, glancing around at my shoes. My sneakers clashed horribly with the rest. "About the shoes?" The door opened just enough for her to slide something across the floor, a pair of black heels. "They're a little tight, but they'll do," she said through the door, her voice half amused, half professional. I stared at them for a moment. Tight was right, I could tell from the size, but there wasn't time to argue. I slipped them on, wincing at first, then stood up, wobbling slightly. It felt like standing on stilts, but I managed to stay upright. When I opened the door, she gave me a quick once-over and raised an eyebrow. "Not bad," she said, nodding approvingly. "You clean up well." I laughed awkwardly. "I look ridiculous." "Only if you think you do," she said with a grin. "Now grab your things. Let's get you to your gate before you miss your flight and cause a scene." We walked briskly through the staff corridor, my footsteps clicking against the floor in a rhythm I couldn't quite believe was mine. Every stride felt exaggerated, every movement amplified, but the guard walked beside me like this was perfectly ordinary. When we reached the main terminal, she stopped and handed me a spare airport jacket to throw over the outfit. "There," she said. "Looks almost official. Just act like you belong." "Act like I belong," I repeated. "Right. Easy." We reached the gate just as the final boarding call sounded. The attendant glanced up, blinked once at my outfit, then back at the guard, who flashed her ID. "He's with me," the guard said smoothly. The attendant nodded and waved me through. Just like that, I was walking down the jet bridge in a borrowed uniform, my mind spinning. The sound of the heels against the metal walkway echoed like a metronome counting down to the next chapter of a story I never meant to start. As I stepped onto the plane, the flight attendant greeted me with a smile, clearly noticing my attire. "Rough morning?" she asked lightly. "You have no idea," I said, forcing a chuckle. When I sank into my seat, I finally exhaled, feeling the adrenaline ebb. My reflection in the dark window stared back at me, composed, strange, but somehow put together. And though I knew I'd probably change back the moment I landed, a small, secret part of me wondered what this day would mean. If I'd ever forget that fleeting, surreal feeling of stepping out of the person I thought I was, and into someone I hadn't met yet. The plane doors closed with a soft thud, sealing in the low hum of air vents and murmured conversations. I leaned back in my seat, trying to look casual even though my heart was still racing. The fabric of the borrowed skirt brushed against my knees every time I shifted, reminding me with every tiny movement just how surreal this was. I kept replaying the past half hour in my head, the mix-up, the security office, the guard's calm tone as if dressing strangers in spare uniforms was an everyday thing. My mind was trying to catch up, to make sense of what had just happened. The woman in the seat next to me glanced over and smiled politely. "You work for the airport?" I froze for a second. Then, realizing the jacket still had the staff logo on it, I forced a laugh. Kind of. Long story." She nodded, apparently satisfied. "Well, you all do a great job. Must be stressful." "Yeah," I said automatically, though inside I was thinking, you have no idea. As the plane began to taxi, I looked out the window. The city lights shimmered below, small and distant, like tiny pieces of a world I'd just stepped out of. My reflection in the glass was faint but distinct, sharp shoulders, tidy collar, the faint shimmer of the pantyhose under the cabin lights. I didn't know whether to laugh or cover my face. But then, slowly, the embarrassment started to fade, replaced by something quieter. Curiosity. I adjusted the sleeve cuffs, straightened the hem, and tried to sit up the way I'd seen the guard do, poised, confident, unbothered. And strangely, it worked. My posture changed, my breathing steadied, and for the first time since I'd spilled coffee on myself, I felt composed. When the flight attendant came down the aisle offering drinks, she paused near my row. "Love your nails," she said absently before realizing I wasn't actually part of her crew. Her eyes flicked down to the uniform, then back to me. "Oh, sorry. I thought you were one of ours for a second."
I smiled awkwardly.
"You're not the first person today."
She chuckled and handed me a water.
"Well, it suits you," she said before moving on.
"It suits you." The words lingered long after she left.
I looked down at myself again, this time less with disbelief and more with wonder. Was it possible that something borrowed, something that wasn't even meant for me, could fit in ways I hadn't expected? By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, my initial panic had turned into quiet fascination. I wasn't used to drawing attention, but now I caught myself studying the little details, how people's gazes shifted, how differently I felt in my own skin. Every movement felt new, deliberate, almost careful, but not uncomfortable.
Somewhere over the clouds, I pulled the small airline blanket over my lap and closed my eyes.
The hum of the engines was steady, soothing. I could still hear the guard's words echoing faintly in my mind. "You'd be surprised what confidence and good posture can do." When the announcement came on that we'd begin our descent soon, I realized I'd been thinking about her. Not just her confidence, but her kindness. She hadn't mocked me, hadn't judged, hadn't even hesitated to help. There was something steady and grounding about her, like she'd seen hundreds of flustered travelers and knew that sometimes a strange situation could teach you something about yourself. As the plane began to descend, I caught my reflection once more in the window. My hair was messy, the borrowed blouse slightly rumpled, but there was something different in my expression. Less frantic, more centered. It was strange how a few borrowed clothes, a skirt, a jacket, a pair of tight shoes, could somehow shift the way I saw myself. Not just in the mirror, but underneath it all.
I didn't fully understand it yet.
But I knew one thing. When I landed, I wasn't just going to return the outfit and forget it ever happened.
Something about this bizarre morning was going to stay with me.
When the plane touched down, the jolt of landing snapped me out of the fog of thoughts I'd been drifting in. The flight had been just under 2 hours, but it felt like I'd been away for days. Like the version of me who boarded back in that chaos wasn't quite the same person who was now rolling slowly toward the terminal. Passengers began to stir, reaching for bags, talking softly. I stayed seated, not out of hesitation this time, but because I didn't want to rush the moment. I looked out at the runway lights blurring past, feeling strangely calm. The panic from earlier had melted into a kind of quiet disbelief. Somehow, I'd survived the most absurd day of my life. When the seatbelt sign went off, I stood carefully, balancing on those unfamiliar heels. My feet protested immediately, but I managed to keep my balance, clutching the seat in front of me for support.
The woman who'd sat beside me smiled again. "Good luck with your shift," she said kindly.
"Thanks," I said before I could stop myself. Then I almost laughed. Technically, I had been on duty in a way, just not for the same airline. As we filed out of the plane, I tried to move with purpose, remembering the guard's words. "Act like you belong." The click of the heels on the jet bridge echoed through the narrow passage, a strange but steady rhythm that, against all odds, started to feel natural. Inside the terminal, the buzz of travelers hit me again. Announcements, laughter, rolling luggage.
I blended into the crowd, or at least tried to.
For once, no one seemed to be staring. Maybe they assumed I worked there, maybe they didn't care. Either way, it gave me a fleeting sense of confidence. I made my way to baggage services, hoping against hope that my real suitcase had been found. The woman behind the counter looked up from her computer.
"Name."
I gave it. She typed for a moment, then smiled.
"You're in luck. Your bag arrived on the next flight."
"It's waiting in claims."
I nearly exhaled with relief. "Thank you."
"You have no idea how glad I am to hear that." As she handed me a tag, she paused, eyes flicking to the uniform jacket I still wore. "You with security?" I froze, then gave the faintest smile.
"Not exactly.
Just temporary loner."
She laughed lightly.
"Well, you wear it well. Go ahead to the carousel on the right." I thanked her and followed the signs, her words echoing behind me.
You wear it well.
My suitcase looked almost apologetic sitting there alone, the bright tag unmistakably mine. I knelt to check inside. Everything intact, the familiar clothes folded neatly, as if mocking the surreal path I'd taken to get here. For a long second, I just stared. Then, almost reluctantly, I zipped it shut again. Somehow, changing back immediately didn't feel right. Instead, I headed for the nearest restroom and stood before the mirror again. The lights buzzed softly overhead, and my reflection stared back. The neat blouse, the dark skirt, the shoes that were now slightly scuffed. My hair was messy from the flight, but the overall image, it still surprised me. I didn't look like a stranger anymore. I looked like someone who had stepped through something, fear, confusion, maybe even shame, and come out steadier on the other side. When I finally emerged from the restroom, my real suitcase in hand, I half expected to feel relief, to rush to change and forget the whole day. But instead, I lingered near a coffee stand, watching travelers hurry past. It struck me how many of them looked just like I had earlier that morning, tense, distracted, barely holding things together. Maybe it took something absurd, something completely unexpected, to make you stop and see yourself. The memory of the guard's calm eyes came back to me then. Her voice, low and steady. You'd be surprised what confidence and good posture can do.
I realized I hadn't even asked her name.
Before heading to my next gate for the connecting flight, I decided to go back to the security checkpoint, to find her and return the uniform properly. Maybe even thank her for what she'd done, not just for helping me make my flight, but for something I couldn't yet put into words. As I walked back through the terminal, the sound of my own footsteps echoed again, steady, rhythmic, somehow no longer clumsy. For the first time all day, I wasn't in a rush. The airport felt completely different now that I was walking through it on my own terms. Earlier, I'd been panicked, flustered, a blur of nerves and spilled coffee. Now, each step felt strangely deliberate. Maybe it was the click of the heels, or maybe it was something deeper, like I'd borrowed not just the guard's clothes, but a bit of her confidence too. I retraced my path toward the security area, passing the same row of shops and the little cafe where I'd spilled half my morning energy in caffeine and nerves. Everything was calmer now, the chaos of the early rush replaced by an almost serene lull between flights. When I reached the checkpoint, I hesitated. The same uniformed officers were there, scanning travelers, giving instructions, but I didn't immediately see her. For a moment I wondered if I'd imagined how kind she'd been, if maybe I'd made her more heroic in my mind than she really was. Then, just beyond one of the conveyor belts, I caught sight of her, tall, calm, that same collected presence as she gave directions to a passenger. There was something grounding about her energy, even in a place built on constant motion. When she finished with the traveler, I stepped closer. She noticed me almost instantly, her eyebrows lifting slightly in surprise before her mouth curved into a small smile. "Well, look who made it," she said.
I grinned despite myself. Made it and back again. And somehow still standing.
"Judging by those heels, that's impressive," she teased lightly, then nodded toward the rolling suitcase at my side.
"I see you found your bag."
"I did," I said, feeling suddenly awkward. I came to return these." I gestured to the borrowed uniform jacket and the rest of the outfit. "I really appreciate what you did earlier. You saved me a lot of trouble." She crossed her arms, studying me for a moment. "You could have just dropped them at the desk. You came all the way back here."
I hesitated. I guess I wanted to say thank you in person.
And maybe to say that the day turned out differently than I expected. Her expression softened, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Differently how?"
I shrugged, unsure how to put it into words. It's weird. I thought I'd feel humiliated the whole time. But somewhere between the panic and the flight, I stopped feeling like I was pretending. It's hard to explain, but it felt grounding. She nodded slowly, like she understood more than she let on. Sometimes stepping out of what's familiar shows you something about yourself you didn't expect. "Yeah,"
I said, a quiet laugh slipping out.
"That's exactly it." She motioned toward a bench near the checkpoint. "Come on.
You look like you could use a break before your next flight." I followed her over, setting the suitcase down beside me. We sat for a few moments in companionable silence, the hum of the airport filling the gaps. She finally asked, "You going home or heading somewhere new?" "Work trip," I said. "Though it feels like a whole other kind of journey now." Her mouth twitched in amusement. Most people go through security trying to avoid attention. You somehow managed to leave with half the staff's wardrobe and a story worth telling. I laughed, shaking my head. Yeah, that about sums it up. You'll probably be talking about this one in the break room for weeks. Maybe, she said, smiling. But probably more as a reminder that sometimes the strangest days are the ones that stick with us. I looked down at the borrowed skirt, the faint sheen of the fabric catching the light. Yeah. I don't think I'll forget this one. She glanced at the departure board, then back at me. You've got time before your connection. Why not grab a coffee? My treat this time. You deserve one you don't spill. I blinked, surprised. You sure? Positive, she said, standing. Besides, I want to see what someone looks like wearing my uniform with that much poise. You've got the posture down better than some rookies. That made me laugh again, but I accepted. We walked side by side toward the nearby cafe, and for the first time all day, I wasn't rushing. As we sat with 2 fresh coffees, no spills, no chaos, I realized how surreal the entire morning had been, yet how oddly natural it felt now. The laughter came easier. The embarrassment faded into something softer, almost nostalgic. And underneath it all, a thought lingered. Maybe this strange, impossible day wasn't just a fluke. Maybe it had shown me a version of myself I'd been too afraid to meet until now. We sat in that small cafe corner like 2 people who had somehow stepped out of the blur of the airport. Everything around us kept moving. Flight announcements, luggage wheels clattering, hurried footsteps, but at our table, time slowed just enough for the moment to breathe. The guard, whose name I finally learned was Renee, stirred her coffee, looking thoughtful. You know, most travelers I help barely remember my face 5 minutes later. They're in too much of a rush to notice who's helping them. You're one of the few who actually came back. I think you made it kind of hard to forget, I said honestly. I've been through plenty of stressful days, but today, I don't know. You made it feel different, like it wasn't just a disaster I needed to escape. She smiled faintly. Well, I'm glad. I've had my share of chaotic travel mornings too. Sometimes, you just need someone to remind you it's not the end of the world. We talked a bit more, about small things at first. Her job, my trip, the weird little details that make airports their own strange world. The kind of conversation that made me forget, for a moment, that I was still dressed like one of her coworkers. But then, as I reached for my cup, I caught my reflection in the dark window next to us. For a split second, it startled me again. The neat uniform, the clean lines, the posture that wasn't mine and yet somehow was. I didn't look like a traveler anymore. I looked like someone who belonged here. Renee noticed the pause. What's on your mind? I hesitated, then said quietly, I keep thinking I should have been mortified by all this. But instead, I feel kind of peaceful. It's like wearing this made me carry myself differently. Like it gave me permission to see a part of me I hadn't before. She studied me for a long moment. Then she nodded, as though she understood more than words could express. It's not about the clothes, she said finally. It's about what they allowed you to see in yourself. Sometimes, it takes something that feels completely wrong to realize what feels right. Her words landed deeper than I expected. I stared down at the coffee cup, tracing the rim with my finger. You really think it's that simple? Simple? No, she said, smiling. But clear, maybe. You wouldn't believe how many people come through here wearing masks they don't even realize they put on. You just happened to notice yours because you switched it so suddenly. I sat back, letting her words sink in. It was true. I'd walked through life carrying myself a certain way, thinking that was who I had to be. But one strange accident had forced me into something unfamiliar, and now I couldn't stop wondering what that meant. After a pause, Renee reached into her pocket and handed me a small airport ID badge holder. Empty, clear plastic, slightly scuffed. Keep it, she said simply. Consider it a reminder. I turned it over in my hands, smiling. A reminder of what? That I'm the traveler who borrowed your uniform. She tilted her head slightly, eyes warm. A reminder that sometimes you don't have to wait for an accident to see who you could be. Something about the way she said it made the back of my neck tingle, like her words had found a place to settle. When we finally finished our coffee, she stood and brushed off her jacket. Your gate's on the other side of the terminal. You'd better start heading that way if you want to make your connection. I nodded and stood as well. Thanks again. For everything.
I mean that.
Renee smiled and reached out to adjust the lapel of the jacket one last time. You handled today better than most people would have.
Don't forget that.
And hey, keep the confidence. Even when you change. Her words stayed with me as I walked away, suitcase rolling behind me. Halfway to my gate, I slowed, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and melancholy. I knew I'd be changing back into my usual clothes soon, but somehow that didn't feel like going back to normal. It felt like leaving something behind. I glanced down at the badge holder in my hand and slipped it into my pocket. Maybe it wasn't about the outfit after all. Maybe it was about the way it made me see myself, and the kind of person I could choose to be, even once I was back in my own shoes. As I walked toward my next flight, the hum of the airport surrounded me again, a constant rhythm of movement and stories crossing paths. For a fleeting moment, I thought I heard Renee's voice again, calm and certain. You'd be surprised what confidence and good posture can do. And for the first time all day, I didn't just believe it. I felt it. The next gate was already boarding when I arrived. My heart gave a small leap of panic before I reminded myself there was no need to rush. This time, I was ready. I showed my pass, smiled at the attendant, and stepped down the jet bridge with the quiet calm of someone who had already survived the morning's chaos. As I found my seat, the rhythm of travel took over again. The shuffle of bags, the polite nods, the muffled sound of seatbelts clicking. Yet beneath it all, I carried that new steadiness with me, something invisible but real. The clothes I wore weren't mine, but the feeling they'd given me, the balance, the awareness, the confidence, felt like it was. Before takeoff, I opened my phone and typed a message to myself in the Notes app, something simple so I wouldn't forget later. Sometimes a mix-up shows you who you are when no one's watching. The plane lifted off, and as we rose above the clouds, I found myself thinking about what I'd say when I got home.
How could I explain this?
If I told anyone the truth, they'd probably laugh or think it was some odd travel story gone wrong. But to me, it didn't feel like that anymore. It felt like the kind of story that changes shape the longer you hold it. Halfway through the flight, I finally opened my suitcase and pulled out my own clothes. The familiar fabric felt safe, comforting, but as I held them, I realized I wasn't in a hurry to change. I'd wear them soon enough, but for now, I wanted to stay as I was, just a little longer, to let the feelings settle. When we landed, I waited until most passengers had left before heading to the restroom. The quiet space hummed softly under fluorescent light. I stood before the mirror once again, just as I had that morning, but everything looked different now. The same reflection, same person, but with something steadier in the eyes, something that hadn't been there before. I changed slowly, folding the borrowed uniform carefully and placing it in a separate compartment in my bag. My own jeans and shirt felt looser, lighter, but also less defined. As if something essential had been left behind in the exchange. When I stepped out, the airport beyond the doors felt larger than before. The echo of footsteps, the swirl of motion, it all seemed to make more sense now. Everyone here was moving, searching, transforming in their own way. I wasn't the only one caught between versions of myself. Outside, the evening air was cool and sharp. I stopped for a moment before the taxi line, taking it all in, the noise, the motion, the thousand small stories brushing past each other. In the crowd, I caught sight of a reflection in a passing window. For a heartbeat, I could almost see that uniformed version of me again, calm and composed, standing tall. And then it faded into the glass, leaving just me, but not the same me who'd stumbled through security hours ago. As the cab pulled up, I slid into the back seat and set my bag beside me. The driver asked where I was headed, and I gave my address automatically, then watched the lights blur outside the window. I thought about Renee's words, about the kindness in her voice and the quiet wisdom in the way she moved through the world. She hadn't done anything extraordinary, just offered help, patience, and a little understanding. As the cab rolled on, I realized something simple but clear. Maybe transformation doesn't need to be loud or permanent to matter. Maybe it's enough to just notice when you've seen a different side of yourself, and to remember that you can find that version again, whenever you need it. The city lights spread out ahead, glowing like the runway I'd left behind. And for the first time in a long while, I felt not just grounded, but quietly sure of where I stood. By the time I reached my apartment, the sky outside had shifted into deep blue. The quiet of home felt almost unreal after the constant hum of airports and planes. I dropped my suitcase by the door, kicked off my shoes, and stood for a moment in the middle of the room, still half expecting to hear boarding calls or rolling luggage. But there was only silence, and that silence felt heavy, full of everything I hadn't yet processed. I opened my suitcase slowly, taking out the folded uniform. It looked smaller now under the soft apartment light, almost ordinary. The jacket, the skirt, the pair of shoes that had carried me through the strangest morning of my life. I laid them out on the bed, smoothing the wrinkles with my hands. For a long time, I just stood there looking at them. I thought about how I had felt in them, at first embarrassed, then frightened, then somehow, steady. I remembered how people had looked at me differently, how I had looked at myself differently. Not because of how I was dressed, but because of what it made me notice. That confidence doesn't always come from certainty, sometimes it comes from daring to stand in unfamiliar shoes, literally or otherwise. I sat on the edge of the bed, the badge holder glinting in the lamplight beside me. My phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unknown number, but I recognized the name right away. Renee, just wanted to make sure you got home safe. Told you you'd handle it better than you thought. A smile spread across my face before I even realized it. I typed back, I did. Thank you again, for everything. You have no idea how much that day meant. Her reply came a minute later. Funny thing about travel, sometimes you lose a bag and find something better instead. I stared at the message, feeling something warm bloom in my chest. It wasn't romantic exactly. It was simpler and deeper than that. It was connection, gratitude, understanding. I set the phone down and looked once more at the clothes on the bed. For a moment, I wondered if I'd ever wear anything like that again. Maybe not. Maybe that day was meant to stay as it was, one strange, fleeting experience that had left an imprint. Or maybe someday, when life felt too small or too predictable, I'd remember how it felt to walk with that borrowed confidence and decide to carry it again, in whatever form made sense. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains. I got dressed for work. My regular clothes, the ones that used to feel like armor. They fit the same as always, but as I looked in the mirror, I noticed a difference. My shoulders sat a little straighter. My chin was lifted just enough to catch the light. It wasn't the outfit that made me feel that way, it was the memory of what I'd learned wearing someone else's. Before leaving the apartment, I slipped the clear ID holder onto my own work bag. It caught the morning light and reflected it softly, a quiet reminder of an unlikely day when everything went wrong just to show me something right. On the subway, I found myself smiling for no reason. A woman across from me caught my eye and smiled back, the way strangers sometimes do when they sense calm in someone else. I returned the gesture, small but genuine. And in that moment, I understood. The day at the airport hadn't just been about lost luggage or borrowed clothes. It had been about losing control long enough to discover something I didn't know I was missing, something as simple as standing tall and breathing deeply, even when the world was turning upside down. When the train pulled into my stop, I stood, adjusted my jacket, and stepped onto the platform. The world around me buzzed with its usual rhythm, people rushing, announcements echoing, doors sliding open and shut. Yet beneath the noise, there was stillness inside me. I walked out into the morning sun with steady steps, not thinking about how I looked or whether I fit in. Just moving forward, quietly certain that somewhere in that airport chaos, I had found a new way to belong, to the world, to the moment, and to myself. And as the city opened around me, alive and endless, I realized that sometimes the strangest detours are the ones that bring you home.